Hey everybody, and welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm the undead ghoul once known as Alistair Stevens, and to celebrate Halloween, we're finally going to begin our discussion of Bram Stoker's immortal 1897 novel, Dracula. Obviously, it's been a minute since I sat in this chair and recorded a podcast for you all. I should mention, this week's episode is pre-recorded for reasons which I'll get to in just a moment, so don't worry if you've missed the live show. Shortly after the last episode that I released, in fact, within 24 hours of the last episode that I released, in fact, you can actually hear my voice deteriorate in the last episode that I released, I was struck down by the novel coronavirus for basically the first time. And I'm going to tell you, I'm very firmly now of the opinion that coronavirus is bad, and we probably ought not to do it anymore. So, get your shots, do what you have to do. But that laid me out for several weeks. It laid me out for a few days and then took away my voice for the better part of a month. So I am just now recovered to the point where I can actually record a podcast again, more or less. Thus the pre-recording, because I already know that I'm going to have to record several versions of this so that I can edit out various coughs and pauses. So all of that is to say, I apologize for my absence. Obviously, I'm not now going to complete my somewhat rash plan to study all of Dracula within the month of October, because I have less than 12 hours left now, and it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. So instead, we're just going to throw the schedule fully onto the autumnal fire that we have blazing here in the podcast studio, and we're going to cover this book for as long as we need to cover this book. I don't imagine it's going to take us very many more weeks than we were initially planning, but we are just going to take our time because this book is fantastic. I am so fully enjoying the process of being just steeped in it, and I have been steeped in it after this absence over the last few weeks. I've just been reading Dracula and reading things about Dracula and learning a great deal and coming to a deeper and more full comprehensive understanding of what is, I think, a very powerful, very singular novel. So in this week's show, ostensibly, we were going to discuss the first 7 chapters of Dracula, but that doesn't seem like it's going to happen. It seems like we're maybe going to struggle to get through just the Jonathan Harker chapters. We'll see how that works out. I'm ambitious. We might get 3, we might get 4 full, complete chapters in the next 45 minutes to an hour. We'll see how that works out. So we're going to begin, of course, with the author's note, which is going to occupy us for just a little while on its own, because it's a really fascinating introductory point to the novel. Of course, the purpose of the author's note is to prompt you how you are supposed to read the novel. It is to give you a framework, to give you a lens by which you might understand this text. And what's so interesting about the author's note to Dracula is that it does exactly that in 2 different ways, depending on where you're standing and what you are paying attention to. Let's begin by reading it. Quote, "How these papers have been placed in sequence will be made manifest in the reading of them. All needless matters have been eliminated, so that a history almost at variance with the possibilities of later-day belief may stand forth as simple fact. There is throughout no statement of past things wherein memory may err, for all the records chosen are exactly contemporary, given from the standpoints and within the range of knowledge of those who made them." End quote. All of which is to say, I guess, hey, you guys, Dracula is an epistolary novel. That's the superficial reading of what Bram Stoker is doing right here. He's introducing the idea that you're about to read a novel that isn't really a prepared narrative as much as it is a collection of texts, a collection of documents, which are ostensibly sourced from the real world. Now, even by the time that Stoker is writing, the epistolary novel, isn't new. It's been around for a long time. In fact, the epistolary novel is the foundation of the modern novel as we understand it. It emerges in 15th century Spain, and there's often there a scandalous, salacious, sexualized, titillating component of early epistolary novels. Normally, they are composed of the collected love letters apparently sent between an amorous couple. This is then expanded a little into the foundation of the Anglophonic canon, including Pamela and Fanny Hill. The first English novel, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, is largely an epistolary novel. The first Canadian novel, The History of Emily Montagu, published in 1769 by Francis Brooke, is an epistolary novel. The first American novel, The Power of Sympathy, published in 1789 by William Hill Brown, also an epistolary novel. The point is this: the epistolary novel is the foundation of the modern novel, and I think that this is a product of a desire to make the novel itself, the book, the artifact, more transparent. I think it is the product of a desire to make the book explain its own existence in a really interesting way, because prior to this, It's not like people weren't reading books, right? The educated classes were absolutely reading histories and autobiographies and books of political treatises and other biographies, not just autobiographies, of course. But these books always have within them an implicit accounting of their own creation, their own production, their own existence. Someone sat down and wrote this book so that the information contained within this book can be communicated to you. And this doesn't happen so much with the novel. There's no accounting for this intermediate step. The novel, in fact, seeks to actively remove the intermediary. We're not really supposed to think about who gathered up Elizabeth Bennet's writings, for example, or indeed did Elizabeth Bennet even sit down and write the story of Pride and Prejudice? That seems somewhat out of character for her, but we're not supposed to think about the process of writing, the process of preparation, the process of publication that leads to the novel that you are holding in your hand. Pride and Prejudice, actually a bit of an odd choice there, because of course First Impressions, the original version of Pride and Prejudice that Jane Austen was sketching out, was in fact also going to be an epistolary novel. And I mean, Pride and Prejudice contains so many letters that it's like half epistolary novel as it is. So the novel does remove the accounting of its own creation. The epistolary novel does not. And it seems to me, therefore, that the epistolary novel is a natural bridge from books which explain themselves, a bound volume of the Histories of the West, for example, and books which do not explain themselves, bound novels. And all of this is to say that the epistolary form is useful because it does remove the need of an accounting for the creation of the book. And it also leans into the idea of, found footage, right? It presents itself as something which is possibly at least true. And as I say, the superficial reading of Stoker's author's note here is simply as an introduction to what an epistolary novel is. This is a collection of documents. They have been sourced. They have been collated. This is what is given to you. Everything that you need is here. All needless matters have been eliminated, right? So what remains is what is important. But that's not the whole story, because I don't think that the Victorian reader is unfamiliar with the epistolary novel. Stoker isn't breaking new ground in terms of presenting to that contemporary Victorian reader a collection of letters and documents which, when combined, tell a complete story. There's something else, it seems to me, happening here. And I think that you can find the source of that in the Victorian era itself, because the Victorian era in England, at least, is a time of empire and of conquest and of wealth and of enormous social and technological transformation. It is also, particularly by the end of the 19th century, a time in which the active deconstruction of many of the old social structures has created a space for a kind of speculation, a kind of supernaturalism, a belief in things which would previously have been either solely the domain of the church or would have been explicitly ruled out by the church, right? It is a time of occultism. It is a time in which Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is attending seances. It is this campaign, this active campaign of the credulous but scientific Victorian mind against the deep secrets of the world. This, to me, is what Stoker is getting at with this author's note, particularly with that line, right? History almost at variance with the possibilities of later-day belief may stand forth as simple fact. We are reasserting something which is deeper and older and more true than latter-day belief. This isn't Epistolary Novels 101, because I don't think that anyone would need Epistolary Novels 101, and it seems strange that Stoker would, in this one way, break his own narrative epistological. Wow, we're really stepping into a different realm there. His narrative epistolary frame. It seems weird to me that Stoker would break that narrative frame one time in order to point out the frame itself. Instead, it seems to me what he's doing here is setting a standard of expectation. He is not introducing the form of the novel as much as he is introducing the tone of the novel. And it reminds me of nothing so much as the credit sequence for the X-Files series, right? It is just hinting at a wider, broader, darker, deeper world. It is acknowledging these supernatural mysteries which are so popular and so prevalent in the Victorian imagination. That is what this opening seems to me, at least, to be doing. What you are about to read is strange but true, because the world is strange but true. It's also, in its collation, kind of hinting at this Victorian modern rationalism, which is, of course, a theme that we are going to return to over and over. There's an argument that Dracula as a novel is the pitting against rationalism of the unknowable and the supernatural, but we'll get a chance to talk about that repeatedly in the weeks to come. And we're going to begin, in fact, right now as we move into Chapter 1, Paragraph 1, entering the East, and our introduction to the voice of our protagonist, at least the protagonist in the first part of this book, Jonathan Harker. Quote, 3rd May, Bistritz. Left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on 1st May, arriving at Vienna early next morning. Should have arrived at 6:46, but train was an hour late. Budapest seemed a wonderful place from the glimpse that I got of it from the train and the little I could walk through the streets. I feared to go very far from the station, as we had arrived late and would start as near the correct time as possible. The impression I had was that we were leaving the West and entering the East, the most western of splendid bridges over the Danube, which is here of noble width and depth, took us among the traditions of Turkish rule. So, we're setting forth our geographical palette here, right? We're getting ready to enter the unknown, but we are entering the unknown, crucially, as an Englishman. We're entering the unknown with the knowledge of the known. We are armed with our German. We are armed with the contents of the British Museum. And you'll note here, too, the specificity with which Stoker anchors us in this world. It is the 3rd of May. We left Munich at 8:35. Incredibly precise, right? We were supposed to arrive in Vienna at 6:46, but we didn't. It was an hour late. As we progress from west to east, the world becomes more and more unreliable. It starts to fall apart. The order, the structure, the strictures that we have put in place in the West, extending from England into France, into Germany, and then, henceforth into Austria, into Romania here. These things are falling apart. They are becoming less reliable the further into the east we progress, right? The most western of splendid bridges over the Danube, which is here of noble width and depth, right? The Danube, this river of great kind of cultural import. It takes us among the traditions of Turkish rule. We are now even extending out of what we would generally consider this Eastern European kind of realm. We're moving into something far more foreign and far more dangerous. But none of that is really significant, because what Stoker here is doing is not really sketching the geography of Europe for us. He's doing something much more important. He's sketching Jonathan Harker's character. And this is important, I think, because it's difficult to read. I'm going to switch back my camera here for just a moment. It's difficult to read Dracula in 2024 without a certain amount of irony. As we discussed in the first episode to this series, Dracula became a cultural phenomenon because Bram Stoker neglected to copyright Dracula properly. And the consequence of that is that Dracula is as ubiquitous in modern popular culture as basically any figure that you can think of. He has at least as much reach and as much interest, as much entanglement in the popular culture as characters like Superman or Spider-Man, who we discussed so recently here on Stars and Swords. And the problem with that is that in the cloak and the cape of Dracula, contained within the cowl of Dracula, a lot of vampire lore has become just shared common knowledge. It has seeped osmotically into the popular imagination, and thus it's very difficult to look at this book from the perspective of a Victorian reader, to whom the vampire, we must be clear, was far from unknown, but which had not yet been actively codified by a definitive novel like Bram Stoker's Dracula. So there's a problem as we move into this book, where we are reading Jonathan Harker as just a naive, stumbling idiot who is incapable of putting together the most obvious suggestions that he is falling under the thrall, under the influence, under the sway and the dominion of Dracula, the world's most famous vampire. But we have to remember that to Jonathan Harker, there was no Dracula. There was no world of vampire lore that he could have explored from the comfort of his cell phone. It wasn't a part of popular culture the way that it is today. So we have to look, I think, a little at how the book presents Harker, how we are supposed to understand him, rather than looking at him from a modern perspective that just presents him as just unbearably naive, just unbearably, if somewhat charmingly, right, and kind of decently naive. Instead, Jonathan Harker is presented to us as, well, a thoroughly modern man, right? He is a professional in Victorian England. He is part of that class which has superseded the aristocracy in terms of their place in society, their influence. He represents the order of lawyers and solicitors, which give English law its structure. He's a decent fellow. He's open. He's condescending, yes, because he does genuinely believe that he comes from the most enlightened, the most progressive, the most good and dominant social culture on earth. But he is at least entering the world with an open heart. He's open to experience. He's open to the local food. He's open to the beauty that can await him here. He is receiving it. And in so doing, he actually represents an interesting turning point, because for about 200 years before the time of Bram Stoker and before the time of Jonathan Harker, the Grand Tour was a rich tradition among young English noblemen, right? The young nobleman would undertake a tour of the continent, often in the company of a tutor or a scholar or a guide of some sort, and would kind of drink in the culture, the history, the geography of what Europe had to offer, and in so doing would return to England a more civilized fellow, a more capable fellow, right? He would appreciate his home more for having journeyed from it, but he would also, I think, appreciate a certain worldliness. And a certain worldliness is a great virtue in the Victorian imaginary, right? That is part of what it takes to be a gentleman. For all that the Victorian mind believes itself to be the pinnacle of human evolution, it's still accepting of a world. And I'm hesitating there only because it is accepting oftentimes of that world in terms of how that world can be exploited by the superior Victorian mind. But it does at least acknowledge borders beyond its own. It acknowledges experiences beyond its own. It is not insular in the way that many other cultures have become more and more insular as we move into the 21st century, it seems to me. So Jonathan Harker is very much in the mold of the young professional man occupying the space of the young nobleman, undertaking this grand tour and leaving behind the comforts of London and going forth into the East. And if you wanted to draw a comparison, if you wanted to really sit down and think about it, and you wanted to think about the ways in which Jonathan Harker talks about the food that he encounters on the way, talks about the people that he encounters on the way, talks about the way in which the trains kind of falter and fall apart as he progresses further and further into the East, as the world becomes more dangerous, more shadowed, more unknowable. And if you wanted to take that Jonathan Harker, that consideration of Jonathan Harker, and compare him to one Bilbo Baggins, I think you've got a thesis on your hands. I think that you could write a really interesting paper comparing those two. Let's move on, not much further though, because we want to continue talking a little bit about this movement from modernity into, well, something else. And what exactly we're moving into is a thing that we can discuss as we move forward. This is our next slide. Quote, "I did not sleep well, though my bed was comfortable enough, for I had all sorts of queer dreams. There was a dog howling all night under my window, which may have had something to do with it, or it may have been the paprika, for I had to drink up all the water in my carafe and was still thirsty. Toward morning I slept, and was wakened by a continuous knocking at my door, so I guess I must have been sleeping soundly then. I had for breakfast more paprika, and the sort of porridge of maize flour, which they said was mamaliga, and eggplant stuffed with forcemeat, a very excellent dish, which they call implatata. Ma'am, get recipe for this, also. I had to hurry breakfast, for the train started a little before 8, or rather it ought to have done so, for after rushing to the station at 7:30, I had to sit in the carriage for more than an hour before we began to move. It seems to me that the further east you go, the more unpunctual are the trains. What ought they to be in China?" So here we're getting the explicit evocation of this gradient of civilization, right? Trains, of course, perhaps the highest peak of the social engineering project undertaken by the Victorians, right? The construction of empire and the construction of trains, probably in that order, but not as far apart as you might think. The reliable train service is used repeatedly throughout Victorian literature as proof of the superiority of English culture at the time, and certainly of this kind of rigor and rationality and consistency. In fact, they are representative here of order and of modernity. And it's important, I think, to recognize that relationship between Victorian England and rationality and modernity, because they thought themselves a very enlightened people. And this is what is so interesting about the Victorian engagement with supernaturalism, with occultism, because they really are engaging with these subjects with the light of knowledge at their hand, right? They are believing that they are moving toward a perfect understanding of the world. And that kind of informs how they approach the unknown, that these things can be understood. Rationalism is a very important thing to have. All things are finally open to human understanding. And this slide really just continues our discussion of Jonathan Harker's character, right? A good, decent man who is yes, far from home and has thus given up all right to comfort, but is at least engaging with the world in a somewhat positive way, even if it's this condescending, superior take on the world. Let's, in the interests of speed, move on a little here and get to our discussion about St. George's Day. This is the woman who is talking to Harker about what day it is. It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you not know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway? Do you know where you are going and what you are going to? She was in such evident distress that I tried to comfort her, but without effect. Finally, she went down on her knees and implored me not to go, at least to wait a day or two before starting. It was all very ridiculous, but I did not feel comfortable. However, there was business to be done, and I could allow nothing to interfere with it. I therefore tried to raise her up and said as gravely as I could that I thanked her, but my duty was imperative and that I must go. She then rose and dried her eyes, and taking a crucifix from her neck, offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for as an English churchman I had been taught to regard such things as in some measure idolatrous, and yet it seemed so ungracious to refuse an old lady meaning so well and in such a state of mind. She saw, I suppose, the doubt in my face, for she put the rosary around my neck and said, "For your mother's sake," and went out of the room. So the woman asks first what day it is, and Harker says May 4th, which is, of course, the rational and correct observation of the date. Crucially here, the woman knows that it is May 4th, right? He is not giving her some information that she does not already possess. He just lacks context. It's not that she is ignorant of his knowledge, it's that he is ignorant of hers. There is a crossover here, and she is the one that is more informed. St. George, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Catholic doctrine, was a 3rd or 4th century Roman martyr sentenced to death in that tradition because he refused to recant his beliefs. He is the patron saint of Georgia, of Aragon and Catalonia and Barcelona, of prisoners and the poor and the sick in Bulgaria. He's the patron saint of Boy Scouts, of soldiers and particularly military cavalry divisions, of weirdly sufferers of skin disease and syphilis. And most importantly for the novel, of course, St. George is the patron saint of England. His patronage of England has deep roots, but is recognized at last during the reign of Edward III in the 14th century, though he has been generally recognized as a special saint in England for at least 300 years before that. But Edward III really wants to leverage the chivalrous dignity of the knight archetype and anchors his sense of valor and courtliness in the 11th century story of George famously slaying the dragon of Selene in Libya. And this is where I will remind you that Dracula's name literally translates as the son of the dragon, though I will also interrupt myself there to give you some additional etymology about this, because this is exciting stuff. In my studies, I have found people not even arguing, just asserting flatly that Dracul, in fact, does not mean dragon, but rather it means the devil, and thus Dracula is not son of the dragon, but son of the devil. And the truth is even better than both explanations, because in different regions and in different periods, in different forms of the Romanian dialect, Dracul means both the dragon and the devil, because what it actually means is ul, meaning the, and drac, meaning evil. It is just evil, whatever form evil might take. So evil and the son of the evil. And all of that, I mean, not so much the etymology, but certainly the invocation and the superstition of St. George, is Stoker taking this opportunity, I think, to not present Dracula as a single exceptional figure. I mean, he is a single exceptional figure in many ways, but he is part of a tapestry of myth and of folklore and of superstition. He is a part of the unknown that isn't just limited to a single solitary vampire living in a crumbling castle. Rather, he is part of a rich, unknown world just beyond the horizon. This takes us back to the author's note. This kind of ties into this idea that the world is weirder and wilder than you can know, dear sheltered Victorian mind. And through the medium of found footage, I am illustrating to you what is true beyond the narrow confines of your own experience. I should also note, just in grim recognition of the political reality in which we all live, that in the last 15 years or so, St. George's Day in particular, the figure of St. George, but to some extent St. George's Day, has become a weird political football in the UK. It's being celebrated by some of good hearts. It wants to be reclaimed by some of good heart as a symbol of a uniquely English identity within the framework of Great Britain, which I think is potentially at least admirable, but that kind of nationalism always tends to sour, and certainly St. George as a figure and St. George's Day particularly has been taken as a banner, a flag to wave by the right-wing white nationalists of the United Kingdom, which is just, of course, predictable and foul, as so many things are here, politically speaking, in 2024. He said, quivering on the brink of a national presidential election here in the US. Let's move on, shall we, to, well, appropriately enough, perhaps, ominous words. Quote, I could hear a lot of words, often repeated, queer words, for there were many nationalities in the crowd, so I quietly got my polyglot dictionary from my bag and looked them out. I must say they were not cheering to me, for among them were Ordog, Satan, Pokol, hell, Strigoica, witch, Vrolok, and Vlkosklak, which mean the same thing, one being Slovak and the other Servian, for something that is either werewolf or vampire. Ma'am, I must ask the Count about these superstitions. End quote. And when I'm talking about Victorian rationality, this is exactly what I am talking about. He enters into a world that is unfamiliar, that cannot be charted really by reference at least to his own natural experience, but can be in some sense understood in a mechanical, procedural way by the use of this polyglot dictionary, right? If you just have a book that contains all the words, then maybe you can make sense of the world around you. And that is revealed, of course, to not be true. We'll also comment here on the word for werewolf or vampire. These legends are not as distinct in the Victorian era, and certainly not like genuinely as distinct in that region at that time as they are in the modern imagination, right? Thanks to Universal Studios, we now have very clear and legally defensible definitions of what constitutes a wolfman and what constitutes a vampire, and those are, all part of some kind of, dark universe that we could doubtless create at some point in the future. But they are distinct. And at this time, that is not the case, as we'll see when we get to our descriptions of Dracula himself. We're going to pause, I think, in our progression here just to observe the search for the buried treasures. I'm looking nervously at the clock as we progress here and thinking that we are still deep in chapter 1. So here we go. One more slide here. This is the recovery of the treasures by the mysterious coach driver, whose identity I'm sure will remain a mystery until the end of the book. Quote, I think I must have fallen asleep and kept dreaming of the incident, for it seemed to be repeated endlessly, and now, looking back, it is like a sort of awful nightmare. Once the flame appeared so near the road that even in the darkness around us I could watch the driver's motions. He went rapidly to where the blue flame arose. It must have been very faint, for it did not seem to illumine the place around it at all, and gathered a few stones, formed them into some device. Once there appeared a strange optical effect. When he stood between me and the flame, he did not obstruct it, for I could see its ghostly flicker all the same. This startled me, but as the effect was only momentary, I took it that my eyes deceived me, straining through the darkness. Then, for a time, there was no blue flame, and we sped onward through the gloom with the howling of the wolves around us, as though they were following in a moving circle. As though perhaps the driver of this trap might in some way control these wolves. The blue flames here, I think, are also a part of that expanded canvas of folklore and superstition and the supernatural in its broadest sense, right, that Stoker is invoking here. It's not really important. It's certainly not tied distinctly and directly to the Dracula myth, to the Dracula lore, as we will come to understand it. Rather, it's a completely separate phenomenon that is just being leveraged here by Dracula in order to presumably fund his trip to England, right? Presumably, this is how he is buying Carfax. This seems to be the understanding to which we are led, particularly when we're looking at the crumbling nature of his home here in Transylvania. So, but we'll get to some of that as we move forward. I did want to pause here to talk about these blue flames, though, right? In medieval folklore, the ignis fatuus, the foolish fire in the Latin, this is exactly the same tradition as the peculiarly, Scottish and Irish traditions of the will-o'-the-wisp, right? These do crop up in other places in other parts of Britain too. But really, I remember in Scotland as a young boy being told about the will-o'-the-wisps and always being careful when you see a wee blue light floating around, because they're usually the lure of a fairy or a pixie or a more demonic creature in more explicitly Christian cultures, and in other places in Europe in particular, the souls of unbaptized children luring travelers into marshes, or in some cases, particularly in Scotland, into the realm of fairy itself. Always beware the will-o'-the-wisp. Here, though, as we'll discover later, the blue flames indicate the presence of these buried treasures recovered by Dracula in the guise of the driver. I know, spoilers. It turns out, you guys, that Dracula is the driver of the carriage, but we'll get to all of that as we go. And that is chapter 1. I am making a mockery of the mockery of my own schedule. So let's try to push on and get at least through the meeting of the Count himself. Quote, "Within stood a tall old man, clean-shaven save for a long white moustache, and clad in black from head to foot, without a single speck of colour about him anywhere. He held in his hand an antique silver lamp, in which the flame burned without a chimney or globe of any kind, throwing long, quivering shadows as it flickered in the draught of the open door. The old man motioned me in with his right hand with a courtly gesture, saying in excellent English but with a strange intonation, 'Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own free will.' He made no motion of stepping to meet me, but stood like a statue, as though his gesture of welcome had fixed him into stone. The instant, however, that I had stepped over the threshold, he moved impulsively forward, and holding out his hand, grasped mine with a strength that made me wince, an effect which was not lessened by the fact that it seemed cold as ice, more like the hand of a dead than a living man." Here again, we have to forgive Jonathan Harker, or not forgive, in fact. We have to appreciate Jonathan Harker for the stand-up, courteous dude that he is, who just happens to not have a century of Dracula-influenced vampire lore at his fingertips. So what that his hand is cold and perhaps more like a dead than a living man? What does that mean? He has no context for what a vampire might be, and even if he had context for what a vampire might be, he wouldn't necessarily recognize this figure as being that, because one of the interesting things about Bram Stoker's Dracula is how little Dracula resembles physically our understanding of what Dracula looks like, right? This is an image that is absolutely codified by Bela Lugosi. This is a figure that really comes into the popular imagination in the 1930s as a part of the Universal movies and the Hammer movies to a certain extent, too. So what do we see here, really? We see, of course, the inversion of the usual trope of vampire invitation, that it is important here. Welcome to my house, enter freely and of your own free will, right? Even that repetition, even accounting for Dracula's somewhat unwieldy usage of the English language, that emphasis seems peculiarly important. It's importantly marked, too, by Dracula standing still until Harker has moved in, and then all at once, well, pouncing, right? Moving forward with such speed and rapidity. We also get, of course, this otherworldly antique silver lamp, this flame that seems to burn in a way that Harker does not completely understand, which may itself be supernatural. And all of this, of course, is contrasted with the excellent English, with the courtesy, the courtliness even. Harker is experiencing something which is outside of his usual domain, yes, but there are the signposts here that tell him everything's good, everything's safe, everything at least is civilized. Let's move on and take a look at his first assessment of Dracula himself. I think we're going to do this in 2 parts because this is probably the most important thing that we're going to discuss in the first half of this novel, so I do want to spend a little bit of time here. Quote, "His face was strong, a very strong aquiline, with high bridges of the thin nose and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty domed forehead and hair growing scantily around the temples but profusely elsewhere. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy mustache, was fixed and rather cruel-looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality in a man of his years. For the rest, his ears were pale, and at the tops extremely pointed. The chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm, though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. Hitherto I had noticed the backs of his hands as they lay on his knees in the firelight, and they had seemed rather white and fine, but seeing them now close to me, I could not but notice that they were rather coarse, broad, with squat fingers. Strange to say, there were hairs in the centre of the palm. The nails were long and fine and cut to a sharp point. As the Count leaned over me and his hands touched me, I could not repress a shudder. It may have been that his breath was rank, but a horrible feeling of nausea came over me which, do what I could not conceal. The Count, evidently noticing it, drew back, and with a grim sort of smile, which showed more than he had yet done his protuberant teeth, sat himself down again on his own side of the fireplace. So what do we see here? Well, the things we recognize, the things which are familiar, right? The dome of the forehead, the aquiline nose, the prominent bridge, these things are usually replicated, but these common, ignoble hands, broad with squat fingers, these are not the hands of a gentleman, certainly not with hairs at the center of the palm. What's so interesting here, and this is so important, I think, to our reading of Jonathan Harker as a valuable protagonist in this book, is that he is employing his own rational technique. He engages here in physiognomy, right? He engages in the quasi-scientific, but during the Victorian period, absolutely scientific practice of studying one's features in order to understand one's personality, one's nature. And what is important about this is that he's right, is that it works, is that he does, in fact, correctly assess Dracula's nature almost entirely from his appearance here. It's easy from a modern perspective to have all of this irony about Harker's naivete, but that is clearly not Stoker's intention. We can tell because he's just correct. The nobility and the strong will, right? The independence associated with this aquiline nose. True, Dracula possesses that. The intelligence of the domed forehead, the cruelty of the mouth, the strength of the bone structure, and, crucially, the bestiality, the animalism of the hair, which grows in such profusion, in tangled profusion, particularly on the hands. Harker interprets a number of things just by looking at Dracula, and he is basically right, even though he's missing perhaps the most important thing, a thing for which his little book of physiognomical detail would carry no information. He doesn't have that in his little polyglot dictionary. But still, his rational approach is valuable, and he does manage to assess a great deal, more so even than he, in this moment, realizes. Open question here whether or not the sharp point to which the fingernails have been cut, if that is actually evidence of grooming on the part of the Count. We can tell, I think, that he does engage in some kind of personal grooming, right? He may not trim his eyebrows to modern standards, but he does at least cultivate his moustache, which requires a certain amount of shaving and cultivation, right? Despite the fact that there are, as we will learn soon, no mirrors anywhere in his home. He does cultivate his moustache, but whether or not his fingernails have been trimmed in 2 points, as Harker suggests here, as Harker infers here, or rather grown naturally in that form, that is open to interpretation. We got just a little more description here, so let's move on to the follow-up slide. This is, oh, I guess no, I did get it all on one slide. This is where we're going to move on to talking about London. Well, we'll get to that in just a moment. There's so much in this opening section here that does become iconic. I haven't pulled slides for it. I'll switch back to my camera here. There's a great deal here that becomes iconic of who Dracula is in the popular imagination, but it's fragmented, so I didn't pull it, right? We have the thing that he does not sup, which will become in the hands of Bela Lugosi, the I do not drink blood, right? There's that very iconic thing. There's the sweet children of the night. There's the children of the night, what sweet music they make, what music they make in the original form here, which is brilliantly taken by Stoker from the work of a friend's mom. You know, he just was casually reading a book by his friend's mom. The friend was Oscar Wilde, and the mom was Lady Jane Wilde, who had compiled a book on Irish folklore and mythology and superstition, in which she is describing the fierce Celtic warriors who came first to Ireland and staked their claim. She is describing them as the children of the night. I have the quote here. This is from Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland by Lady Jane Wilde. Quote, "From long wandering through the gloomy regions where the sun is darkened by perpetual clouds, they called themselves the children of the night and looked on her as the primal mother of all things." So, I mean, if you're going to just steal from your friend's mom, better steal the best, I guess. It's pretty powerful stuff. Let's move back to our slide as we progress on here. Harker goes to sleep that night with a a prayer for his own soul, and wakes the next day to find himself alone. Interestingly, in the early sketches, in that 100 page of notes that we discussed in last week's session, in the previous episode, I should say, Dracula was intended to have two servant figures who would appear, a silent man and a, quote, deaf mute woman. But in this finished form, he appears to be alone in his house. Well, not alone, obviously, as we'll see very soon, but at least he doesn't seem to carry a staff at this point. Harker foreshadows the scene with the shaving mirror, which we'll get to hopefully this week, good lord, and then switches that to a discussion of Dracula's well-stocked library, including these directories of people in certain respectable professions in London. The Red Book here is everyone who works for the government or who still receives a pension from the government. The Navy and Army books, as you might expect, include lists of every commissioned officer currently in service. The Law Book includes everyone currently qualified to work as a solicitor, a barrister, or a judge in England. The Blue Book is a series of reports published by Parliament about the function of the government, and Whitaker's Almanac, as the name suggests, is a collection of miscellaneous information about agriculture and demographics and geography and the economy and that kind of thing. So we're seeing here that Dracula has certainly this bestial side, this ancient side almost, and is strong, physically threatening. He has these qualities, but is also fiercely intelligent. This is perhaps the most important quality that Dracula possesses. This is the slide that we're finally getting to here, is his return and his discussion of his plans. Quote, "I am glad you found your way in here, for I am sure there is much that will interest you. These friends," and he laid his hands on some of the books, "have been good friends to me, and for some years past, ever since I had the idea of going to London, have given me many, many hours of pleasure. Through them, I have come to know your great England, and to know her is to love her. I long to go through the crowded streets of your mighty London, to be in the midst of the whirl and rush of humanity, to share its life, its change, its death, and all that makes it what it is. But alas, as yet I only know your tongue through books. To you, my friend, I look that I know it to speak." "But, Count," I said, "you know and speak English thoroughly." He bowed gravely. "I thank you, my friend, for your all too flattering estimate, but yet I fear that I am but a little way on the road I would travel. True, I know the grammar and the words, but yet I know not how to speak them." End quote. A certain irony there that Dracula is, of course, so articulate and so well composed, and yet considers himself such a novice for reasons which we will get to in just a moment. The last part of that first para, "To you, my friend, I look that I know it to speak," is a classic example of Dracula fumbling his English syntax somewhat. This, "I look to you to teach me to speak aloud what I can read," is how I take that. So here we get this implicit contrast of London and Transylvania. What stands out to Dracula about London, and what can we therefore infer about his life in Transylvania? Much of this is going to be confirmed, of course, in the pages to come. "I long to go through the crowded streets of your mighty London." So we're immediately, right, envisioning this populated world as a contrast to the almost solitary life, or as we expect at this point, completely solitary life of the Count himself. To be in the midst of the whirl and rush of humanity, to share its life, its change, its death, and all that makes it what it is. It's interesting here, too, that he is absolutely personifying both England and London in exactly the way that the Victorian Englishman embodies these places, right? That they are themselves regal, that they are themselves in some way the body of Victoria, right? They are in some sense these regal figures who can be loved, right? To know her is to love her. This is, I think, a reflection of Stoker's perspective on England, and certainly a perspective of the Victorian mind that does attribute to England in this period the greatest height of civility, the greatest height of culture, right? That England is the shining star in the Silver Sea, right? That it is a valuable and worthwhile place. And Dracula's looking to that. I mean, I would read some flattery of the English sensibility, right? I think there's something in Stoker's work here that is flattering the English reader, the primarily English reader of this novel at that point. But it is also reflective of this clash of ancientry and modernity. It is also representative of a state of change, of flux, as we discussed earlier. The Victorian era is a period of colossal physical, geographical, social, industrial transformation. And by inference here, Transylvania is still and silent and does not change. He doesn't have the whirl and the rush of humanity. Let's push on to the next slide, because this is really where he lays it out for us. Indeed, I said, you speak excellently. Not so, he answered. Well, I know that, did I move and speak in your London, none there are who would not know me for a stranger. That is not enough for me. Here, I am noble, I am boyar, the common people know me, and I am master. But a stranger in a strange land, he is no one, men know him not, and to know not is to care not for. I am content if I am like the rest, so that no man stops if he sees me, or pauses in his speaking if he hears my words to say, ha ha, a stranger. I have been so long master that I would be master still, or at least that none other should be master of me. A stranger in a strange land. Of course, Dracula has read his Bible. Boyar here is particularly interesting because it is an old aristocratic rank in Russia and in Eastern Europe that represents kind of third in line to the king after the princes, which means like in the Western European feudal tradition, it would be equivalent to a duke. So Dracula, rather than being a count, which is a rank equivalent to earl, would actually be like a couple of steps higher on the feudal ladder if we were to really acknowledge that this is, again, a true rank. And again, we have to question, how much is true here? Are Jonathan Harker's understandings of what, or are, in this case, Dracula's words, reliable? Are they true? Is he speaking metaphorically, or is he speaking literally? Does he actually hold a noble title? Does he actually play a part in the aristocratic community of this region? Well, it seems as though he doesn't, honestly, but we can't be certain about that. We can maybe continue to infer as we move forward. What's so important here, though, is what language unlocks for you. And we must remember that the Victorian era is an era of imperialism. It is an era of active colonialism, but it is also an era in which the British Empire is not just spreading to other parts of the world, but those parts of the world under the assist of modern technology are being unified into an expanded Britain. To be English, to pass as an Englishman, to speak without an accent, to speak with the correct grammar, to be able to, as he says, so that no man stops if he hears me, or pauses in his speaking if he hears my words to say, ha ha, a stranger, right? To be normalized into Anglophonic culture is a mark of credibility, of respectability, of authority, and coming with that, a kind of freedom. This is what Dracula observes here at the end. I have been so long master, I would be master still, or at least that none other should be master of me. To be recognized as an outsider is to be subservient or subordinate to others. It is to be, potentially at least, dominated by the will of those around you who do conform to your society, right? In this way, Dracula is absolutely in accord with so many of the texts that we've studied so far here in Stars and Swords, and our recurring drumbeat about the ways in which societies protect themselves by redefining and redefining who is to be included and who is to be excluded. In this world, to be perceived as a native English speaker, which is really what Dracula wants, right? It's not about communication. It's not about the ability to make himself understood. He's clearly capable already of making himself understood. It is about the appearance of naturalism. It is about that kind of social invisibility. If he can achieve that, then he is effectively included in the Anglophonic culture. He is included in, he will be counted a Victorian gentleman if he can pass audibly as a Victorian gentleman. And of course, I've pulled it for the title of this week's session, but the composition of this line, and again, we're talking so much about what Stoker's intent is and how this is delivered. We're going to have the opportunity, I think, much later in this book to spend more time talking about Stoker's actual skill as a writer. But this is absolutely masterful, right? This is just knockout writing from any perspective in any time period on any subject. This is just brilliantly written. Here I am noble, I am boyar, the common people know me, and I am master, right? Even just the rhythm of that is so good. To know not is to care not for is beautifully ungainly, right? He is getting it wrong. He is demonstrating even in that moment that he would be excluded from polite society in London, speaking as he now speaks. But in that clumsiness, there is a poetry. There is something that is deeper, perhaps only because it's unexpected, right? Sometimes that's what poetry can do. Poetry can just reframe the English language in a way that it slips through your defenses, that it cuts you to the quick, even if you don't expect it. They talk some more here, and Dracula largely answers Harker's questions, even though Harker is already clear on the point that his host is only speaking with him, is only answering his questions because he wants to bathe in the sounds of spoken English, right? He wants to soak up all that Harker has to offer. We then return to the subject of the will-o'-the-wisps and the treasures hidden beneath the earth. We'll get to this slide here. "That treasure has been hidden," he went on, "in the region through which you came last night. There can be little doubt, for it was the ground fought over by centuries by the Wallachia, the Saxon, and the Turk. Why, there is hardly a foot of soil in all this region that has not been enriched by the blood of men, patriots or invaders. In the old days there were stirring times, when the Austrian and the Hungarian came up in hordes, and the patriots went out to meet the men and the women, the aged and the children too, and waited their coming on the rocks above the passes, that they might sweep destruction on them with artificial avalanches. When the invader was triumphant, he found but little, for whatever there was had been sheltered in the friendly soil." "But how," said I, "can it have remained so long undiscovered when there is a sure index to it, if man will but take the trouble to look?" The Count smiled, and as his lips ran back over his gums, the long, sharp canine teeth showed out strangely. He answered, "Because your peasant is at heart a coward and a fool. Those flames only appear on one night, and on that night no man of this land will, if he can help it, stir without his doors." So, no peasant, no man would venture out of doors on a night like that night. No man would venture to those flames because, they're a superstitious and cowardly lot. No coach driver or whatever, presumably, would go out on a night like that. And again, it is not that we're supposed to read Harker here as being naive. It's moments like this where Stoker is absolutely playing fair with the reader who would have no underlying expectation of specific answers to this mystery, right? It is obviously reading as something strange and mysterious and otherworldly, but he wouldn't necessarily jump to, and here is Dracula laying out his entire deal. The artificial avalanches here, the story that Dracula tells, appear to be true. They appear to be a reference to an invasion of Romania by Hungary in the 14th century and the casting down of rocks by the Romanian army on Hungarian troops trapped in narrow, winding canyons and passageways. Harker here goes off to recover his paperwork on the house Dracula is buying in England and returns to find his host, quote, lying on the sofa, reading of all things in the world an English Bradshaw's Guide. A Bradshaw's Guide, for those of you keeping track at home, is a railway timetable, which takes us all the way back to our discussion of trains as the symbol of order and regularity of a well-functioning society at the beginning of today's session. Harker then describes the estate at Carfax, and interestingly, he gets the etymology here wrong. Carfax is an anglicized Latin for crossroads, where four roads meet equally, which is significant because of the old belief that victims of suicide were buried at crossroads because of the fear that victims of suicide might rise from the grave, unquiet as they were, and that the crossroads would confuse them on which way to go, lest they seek some kind of retribution. We'll note, too, that Carfax is out in Essex, about 20 miles east of London, just north of Kent, where young Pip Pirrip grew up. It is possible that Carfax and Sadie's house are only like a day's walk from each other, though Pip, of course, was born almost a century before Harker found his way to Transylvania. We should take this opportunity, actually, to clarify that Dracula, published in 1897, is set in 1893. That's the year that lines up with Stoker's painstakingly outlined timeline and with the dates in the finished book, as well as lining up with some specific references. Later we will have the reference to the death of the French psychiatrist Charcot, who Mina talks about in chapter 14, and the founding of the Westminster Gazette, which will be referenced later and will also appear. We'll draw actual documents from the Westminster Gazette later in this epistolary bundle. So why, we might wonder, does Dracula want a house? Here we are. Our last slide. We've got so much left undone. Quote, "I am glad that it is old and big. I myself am of an old family, and to live in a new house would kill me. A house cannot be made habitable in a day, and after all, how few days go to make up a century. I rejoice that there is a chapel of old times. We Transylvanian nobles love not to think that our bones might be amongst the common dead. I seek not gaiety nor mirth, not the bright voluptuousness of much sunshine and sparkling waters which please the young and gay. I am no longer young, and my heart through weary years of mourning over the dead is not attuned to mirth. Moreover, the walls of my castle are broken. The shadows are many. The wind breathes cold through the broken battlements and casements. I love the shade and the shadow, and would be alone with my thoughts when I may. Somehow, his words and his look did not seem to accord, or else it was that his cast of face made his smile look malignant and saturnine. So we are now barely at the point where we can start to ask some informed questions about Dracula. What is this place in Transylvania? Why is it falling into disrepair? Where are the servants? Why are the walls broken? Who are the dead that he has mourned? And through these questions, we can begin to see, I think, a little more clearly what attracts him to England, right? This is the counterpoint to that earlier description of London, that maelstrom of life and activity and transformation and birth and death and everything in between. London is vibrant. It is alive. Transylvania is silent and still and shadowed. So that's the superficial account, right? He's, in some sense, perhaps chasing modernity. That is what Dracula wants. The world is leaving him behind, and it's leaving him in a crummy old castle in Romania. That, at least, is a possible interpretation. But look at that last passage. Somehow his words and his look did not seem to accord, or else it was that his cast of face made his smile look malignant and saturnine. He's giving this account, but even Harker, present there in the room with him, doesn't quite believe it. It's not quite true. There's a depth there. And of course, we, with our knowledge, can understand what kind of malice would accompany Dracula's desire for solitude, would accompany his desire to be separate from society and not engage with, particularly, I guess, sunshine and sparkling waters, right? Two things which are notoriously dangerous to vampires, but which do not crucially seem to have any effect on Dracula whatsoever. This is one of the ways in which Stoker sets the template that will later be refined. Like our popular conceptual understanding of Dracula is not quite what Stoker lays out, even though Stoker is incredibly influential. Let's move on. We've got one more here. Yeah, as you can hear, I think my voice is giving out. But dignity and pride and self-esteem demand that I at least cover 2 of the 7 chapters that I set out to discuss. Let's do some serious vampire lore here. And our first glimpse of blood. This is the incident with the shaving mirror. Quote, "Suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder and heard the Count's voice saying to me, 'Good morning.' I started, for it amazed me that I had not seen him since the reflection of the glass covered the whole room behind me. In starting, I had cut myself slightly, but he did not notice it at the moment. Having answered the Count's salutation, I turned to the glass again to see how I had been mistaken. This time there could be no error, for the man was close to me, and I could see him over my shoulder. But there was no reflection of him in the mirror. The whole room behind me was displayed, and there was no sign of a man in it except myself. This was startling, and coming on the top of so many strange things was beginning to increase the vague feeling of uneasiness which I always have when the Count is near. But at the instant, I saw that the cut had bled a little, and the blood was trickling over my chin. I laid down the razor, turning as I did half around to look for some sticking plaster. When the Count saw my face, his eyes blazed with a sort of demoniac fury, and he suddenly made a grab at my throat. I drew away, and his hand touched the string of beads which held the crucifix. It made an instant change in him, for the fury passed so quickly I could hardly believe it was ever there. 'Take care,' he said. 'Take care how you cut yourself. It is more dangerous than you think in this country.'" Which, if this is going to be our last slide, is a pretty good place to stop our discussion of Dracula here on All Hallows Eve. This is, of course, classic vampire lore. Vampires do not show up in mirrors. There's a really interesting extension here. Earlier in this chapter, I didn't pull the slide, but earlier in this chapter, Harker mentions his Kodiak. He mentions his rudimentary camera with which he has taken pictures of Carfax. And a really interesting idea that Stoker has in his 100 pages of notes, which unfortunately didn't make it to the finished novel, was that if you take a photo of Dracula, all you see is his skeleton, which is kind of cool and is actually a take on vampire mythology that I've never heard before. I think that's so fascinating. Why that would be true I just think is so rich. It's such a curious perspective on how these things work. But yes, he does not show up in mirrors. There are many suggestions of why this may be, why this particular part of vampire folklore may be included. Partly it's the idea that mirrors were backed with silver, and thus the silver itself would counteract. The place of silver in vampire lore is also very strange and dubious and flexible because, of course, of the ways in which silver is also tied into werewolf lore. We'll perhaps unpick some of that as we move forward, and certainly we'll unpick it in a bonus episode if we do indeed watch Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, to give it its full and unwieldy name. We'll maybe talk about that over on the Patreon page at some point in the weeks to come. But here we see, the mystery of Dracula, that presumably what happens here is that he himself does not see the mirror as he approaches Harker from behind. Although I guess if Harker is... that's interesting. If Harker believes that he should have seen Dracula in the mirror, then presumably the mirror would be visible to Dracula too. That's how mirrors work. So maybe the small shaving mirror is not occluded, but perhaps it is so small and Dracula is paying insufficient attention that he doesn't realize that the mirror is there. Certainly when he discovers that the mirror is there, he throws it from the window and curses it as a sign of man's own vanity, that it is an ignoble and impious thing, which is a pretty great line to take if you are just asserting social dominance over this poor Englishman who has found himself now without his shaving mirror in the company of your home. But of course, it is the blood that is the most significant thing. Well, it's partly the blood, right? It's the blood, and it's also the existence of this holy symbol that Harker is wearing around his neck. Both of these things in close proximity. It's extremely charged. I guess what we'll do, we'll call an end to this podcast here, I think, he said, hesitantly looking ahead at the slides and thinking, but there's so much to talk about. That's going to do it for this week, at least for the next few days. How about that? How about we compromise? And how about I return on Monday evening with the next live session, in which hopefully we'll be able to progress. I think we'll be able to make it through chapters 3 through 7 on Monday night. They move much more quickly. They're actually about the same length, or slightly longer than what we've already read this week. So we can maintain the pace and hopefully make it through to the end of chapter 7. Thank you guys so much for your patience. If you have thoughts, if you have ideas, if you have commentary, then please do get in touch and let me know. You can email me directly, starsandswordspod@gmail.com. Or you can come over and join the Discord community, from which I have been largely absent over the course of the last few weeks, mostly in shame at my own fragile human body and its sufferances, but to which I am glad to return. And you can come and join the discussion over there. You can head over to patreon.com/nextword, patreon.com/nextword. Pledge the price of a cup of coffee every month, and you can join that community. You get access to lots and lots of bonus episodes for Stars and Swords, certainly. Also for my other podcast, which has now concluded, The Last Star in Hollywood, and for my forthcoming podcast. And by forthcoming, I mean really any minute now. It has already been submitted to iTunes, so it's going to be available very, very soon. Don't you know me by now? A meandering walk through the texts of Richard Linklater's classic Before trilogy films, Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, Before Midnight, 3 of my favorite films in the world. Elizabeth Ray and I, the brilliant Elizabeth Ray and I, are going to discuss those films in incredible depth. We are literally taking it sequence by sequence, kind of vignette by vignette. We're going to spend more than 20 weeks talking about those 3 films and talking about everything that spirals out from those 3 films, talking about life experiences and philosophy and all the many things that arise when you are engaged in great conversation. And I just realized that I left my slide up and had not returned to my camera. Guys, thank you so much for your patience. Happy Halloween to everyone. If you have not yet made plans to go vote and you live here in these United States, then please go make plans to vote. Could not be more important. I will talk to you all on Monday evening. I'm thinking 8 Central over on the YouTube page. If you want the link to the live broadcast, then head on over and join the Patreon page. That link will be posted over there, or you'll be able to watch the video or listen to the podcast in the immediate aftermath, probably sometime later Monday evening. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your patience. I will talk to you all again soon. Until then, take care.